Kijk, zij staan daar nog. Buiten. Ja, dat is jouw koffie. Dit is heel suiker. Oh. Ik denk het. Ik heb het niet echt aan uitgenomen. Oh, blijf jij anders hier zitten? Toch? Voor de... Of niet? En dan straks kunnen we wel samen ergens... Ja, oké. Yes, hello and welcome everyone to the Research Parade 2022. It's good to see you all here and also hello to the watchers at home. Today we will talk about migration, which is a very important subject. People often think of migration as a recent phenomenon. However, migration has been a feature of human existence for centuries. Humans have always migrated in groups and as individuals to seek freedom from war and conflict, to escape hunger and poverty, to find new economic opportunities and employment, to flee from religious intolerance or political repression, or even to trade and to travel to new places. Today we have four teachers and professors who will be presenting their research about migration. Due to some unforeseen circumstances, there have been a few changes in the program today. Unfortunately, Saskia Stevens cannot be here, and due to the storm, only Mardu can present her research in person, and the rest will be online. I hope you all enjoy the presentations and on the various studies of migration. And then I would like to give the floor to Mardu Schover.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me and for having me here. I, of course, studied in Utrecht, some of you may know, and was a very active member of the USK at one point. Yeah, sure, seriously. I organized all sorts of gatherings like these when I was a student. So I'm sure this will bring you as far as I came in your studies. Yes, and when I studied in Utrecht, I studied with Jan Lucasse, who is the older brother of Leo Lucasse, and it was important in putting migration studies on the map at one point in time. So, so the question I'm going to address a bit is why migration history matters. So why do we have to look at this subject from an historical perspective, which of course I'm convinced of, but I hope to convince you as well of this. If you have any questions, please say so, raise your hand and shout out, and I will try and address your question. Before getting into the subject in more detail, I think it's important to point out this, and that's the biases in the literature. Migrants who do not assimilate, currently and in the past, always get much more attention than those who don't. So than those who do. So what you see, for instance, the Catholics who moved to the United States in the 19th century, they sort of disappeared within US society rather rapidly. They are not studied extensively, whereas Orthodox Protestants who migrated from the Netherlands to the US and held on to their religion and their culture and their language for decades, until now more or less, they are studied extensively. So you see an enormous bias towards non-integration rather than integration. Over time, you see that comparisons have become more important, but sometimes they're rather random. What is still a problem is that migrants are seldom given a voice. We try, But as so far, it's mostly about migrants and not so much by migrants. And of course, you know these studies, you may know these studies where you have interviews, but then sometimes it's just a series of interviews connected to each other, but not really saying, okay, what does this add to the more generic knowledge about migration? And so we try, but we have still a long way to go before we get to actually giving people a voice in this story. Much more importantly, perhaps, is the rest versus the West. If you look at the number of studies on migration to, from, and within the West, compared to the number of studies about the rest of the world, the bias is very, very strong. I mean, there's an enormous numbers of studies about Finns moving to the United States, Danes moving to the United States, Germans moving to the United States, on and on and on and on. And then you see very few studies about migrations in China, migrations in the Soviet Empire, or migration in Russia, migration in Africa. And so also here, we try to make a difference as historians, but also here you can say, yeah, we're not very successful yet. And so for you as future historians, future academics, I think it's important to, I encourage my students to work on this and to try and move away from this Eurocentric, Western-centric perspective. It's also more about immigrants than about people who left. So it's more about people who came than about people who left, immigrants versus immigrants. This, of course, has to do with authorities. Authorities, as a rule, cared much more about the people who came than those who left. Early modern period, slightly different, because they didn't want to see the labor force leave, or they didn't want to see the potential soldiers leave. But as you move on into time and get to the 19th century, you see that authorities start to care a lot about people who are coming, and especially about poor people coming. In the United States, you have this clause, likely to become a public charge. So authorities say, okay, all the paupers are on the move to the United States. We don't want them here. If you're rich and a migrant, nobody cares. If you're poor and a migrant, everybody cares. And the chances that you have to, you as an authority, you as a church, you as a city, have to support poor migrants, worries all the authorities all the time. And so we know much more about people who come, also because the authorities worried more, produced more sources on those who came. So the bias is also a result not only of interest, but also a result of the fact that we have much more sources on those who came than those who left, although it's two sides of the same coin, of course. And then there's many more studies about the spectacle, the spectacular forms of migration, people who cross the Mediterranean on rickety boats, rather than people who move by plane or by train. And so there's lots of stories, lots of information in the news. You will see much more coverage of people who walk or come on boats, rather than those who travel by regular form of transport, such as trains and planes, although most migrants do move in a regular form. And then there are studies in migration that are not studied as much, they are studied, but not as part of migration research, although they are. Slavery, for instance, there's a large number of publications on slavery, but it's not included in the literature of migration studies so much. Any idea why? Why is slavery not included? Yeah, so this is clearly one reason. People very often say, okay, migration is if you choose to move. Refugees, okay, maybe they still had a choice, stay or die. But slavery, you were just put on a ship. So, yeah, okay, so free and forced migration. We as migration historians say, okay, people who move are migrants. But slavery, yes, nobody chose to do that. And then somebody had just moved these people. But as were others, forced laborers were moved. And so, okay, you might be debatable. It's also because it's an amoral form of migration. As slavery is an amoral form of migration. So fitting it into the framework of migration sort of normalizes a practice, which was, of course, not normal. And so that's also why people sort of shy away from including it. Adoption, international adoption, is very often also not included in migration studies. So there's a large number of studies on adoption, 30,000 or something like that. But they don't discuss inter-country adoptions as a form of migration. And the reason for that is that they're very often seen as the easy adapters, as the people who didn't have to make an effort because they had all, everything you wanted. They ended up in middle-class families. They were taught the language from the early beginning. They got citizenship upon arrival, a few months after arrival. So, it's the unproblematic category, which of course is not quite true. So I have this one article, which you see here about international migration, about inter-country adoption and migration, in which I sort of make this claim: beware, it's not, it is a form of migration, and sort of denying that also denies, that this, also inter-country adoption, is a story about inclusion and exclusion. Okay, and the other point I think is important is this one, intersectionality. I'm sure you're very much aware of the fact that this is the dominant term to use currently. Everybody uses it. If you're Joris Luitendijk, you talk about de zeven vinkjes, but rather everybody else talks about intersectionality. He invented an alternative term, but it's still the same. Intersectionality, and what it says is you have to study categories of power and identity, such as gender, class, ethnicity, religion, ability, disability, and etc., within the same context. So what's important is that you don't study them in isolation from each other, but you as a researcher, but also as a policymaker, have to study these categories of identity and power at the same time, simultaneously. And that's, of course, difficult. It's very difficult to do. I mean, it sounds very easy, but put yourself in the place of a policymaker, and the national government says, okay, you're a civil servant, you work for the municipality of Utrecht. Okay, design a policy where you take into account all these categories of identity and power. Well, you don't have the time, you don't have the money, you don't have the skills to do that. So authorities prioritize, and they start to address one point of identity and power much more than other points of identity and power. You would, anybody would, because it's very difficult to juggle all these terms at the same time. But still, it's important to do that, because how societies deal with one form of diversity, ethnic diversity, is very much connected to how they deal with other forms of diversity, like sexuality or religion. And so it is important to take these, to look at diversities, multiple, rather than a diversity, because dealing with one form of diversity, how societies, how authorities, how the media deal with one form of diversity is not disconnected from how people, authorities, journalists deal with other forms of diversity. Okay, so this is important, intersectionality. And the other one is, of course, a thing that's also very much at the forefront of debates about migration currently, and that's how we talk about migrants, how we talk about migration. Language matters. And so what words we choose, the terms that we use to describe people, they are important too. What we actually say about people. You can't sort of say that terms are neutral. Terms are never neutral. For instance, the term asylum seeker didn't exist until the 1980s. In the 1980s, until the 1980s, you had refugees. Some people who thought these refugees were not honest about their motives talked about bogus refugees, pseudo-refugees, all sorts of words. But the word asylum seeker did not exist, not in the Dutch language, not in German, not in English, not in French, none of the languages. And in the 1980s, when procedures become longer, when the distrust regarding refugees becomes stronger, when it takes longer between applying and getting refugee status, and also fewer people arrive with refugee status granted by the UNHCR, just before getting to a country, the word asylum seeker is introduced to describe also, well, the limbo that people are in, the waiting period that people are in, but also expressing a sort of, well, element of doubt. Are these real refugees? They need a different word because they think, are they not? And asylum seekers, not by accident, sounds the same as fortune seekers. It was chosen to sound like that. And so words are never neutral. They do matter, the words we choose. The question is also, and this is very much Foucault, of course, what is the problem? What's the problem? Who is the problem? And whose problem is it? Are we supposed to, is it our problem? And we are supposed to solve it. Is it somebody else's problem, that of the migrant? Not our problem to solve. And you see that in the language, there's lots of emphasis on sensationalization, the spectacle, using words like flood. We talk about migrants as if they're water. That's very surprising, right? If you look at the news, any news item, they talk about floods of migrants or streams of migrants. And that's, of course, not by accident, right? If you talk about a flood or a stream or a tsunami, if you will, you talk about migrants as if it's a problem you can't stop. And water, just, try to stop water with your hands. You can't. And so talking about migrants as if they're water also signifies the fact that you think that we have a problem which is very hard to deal with. If you don't talk about migrants if they're water, people talk about migrants if they're plants. They're transplanted, uprooted. They're not plants, they're people. So dehumanizing them is also a form of categorizing, labeling migrants. So words matter. What you also see is that some people go, talk about the current migrations by saying, yeah, currently we have people who are problematic, but not so in the past. They sort of pitch the good migrants of the past against the bad migrants of today. They say Huguenots, the people who are the Protestants who fled from France. They came with connections, trade networks, colonial ties, skills, money. Yeah, that's what some people thought when they came. But it wasn't, of course, the truth. The truth was that it was a mixed population, as any migration is now. But people started to sort of make these calculations. Is migration, was it in the 17th century, was this profitable to Dutch society or not? Can we put pluses and minuses to it? Can we say, yeah, this migration was good for Dutch society and the current migration is not? So these calculations, of course, depend very much on who you're asking and how you're counting. You're asking the migrants, not asking. So the thing is, words matter. The terms we use matter. Statistics matter. Here you go. People say, okay, look, this is 1960s. 93 million people on the move. And now we've moved to 244. That's an increase. Yeah, it is. 93 until 244 is a very sharp increase. It is 3% of the population in 1960 as it is now. So percent-wise, we don't see an increase in migration. We only see an increase in numbers as we see in the world population. All these fears about, everybody's on the move. Well, they're not justified. Migration. This is also important to sort of frame the story I'm telling, and that is there are actually only 4 categories of migrants legally. Refugee migrants, these are the people who are defined by the 1951 Refugee Convention. And the 1951 Refugee Convention is our Refugee Convention. The current Refugee Convention is the 1951 Refugee Convention. Asylum seekers are simply people who haven't been granted refugee status yet. People who say, I'm a climate refugee. Very often students ask, how do I then categorize climate refugees? Well, if they're not protected by their state, they can be refugees. If they're fleeing because their livelihood has been threatened, the land has been flooded, they're economic migrants. So you see all sorts of subcategorizations, but they're always subcategorizations of these 4 categories, which I mentioned here. Labor migration is the free movement of workers, Treaty of Rome, 1957. This is, of course, the basis of the current EU. At that time, authorities said, look, people have to be able to move freely, workers have to be able to move freely within what was the founding states of the current EU. And later this became, all people within countries, not just workers. So we have labor migrants. Family migration is Article 8 of the Convention of the Protection of Human Rights Council of Europe. Also, 1950, this is not by accident. This has everything to do with the shame about not being able to regulate migration until that time, and especially the failure to save the Jewish population during the war. And so it's not by accident that many of these things come from the 1950s. So what does this Article 8 say? The Article 8 says a husband and wife, spouses, parents and children have the right to live together. And as a state, you cannot say, for instance, a man is here, originally came from Morocco, his wife wants to join him from Morocco. Oh, Article 8 means I can't sort of separate them. Well, you go back to Morocco in that case. Then I didn't separate you either. That's not allowed. Strasbourg, International Court of Law says you can't say non-separation is sending both back. And the last one is colonial migration, post-colonial migration. people returning from the former colonies because they do have citizenship of the country that colonized the country they come from. The word game you see coming in here very nicely when it comes to the Refugee Convention. The Refugee Convention says, okay, we don't include people who are displaced persons. Displaced persons are not refugees. So DPs are not refugees. They are just simply in the wrong place. This is the influence of the Soviet Union at that point in time. The Soviet Union says, look, they're in the wrong place. Once the bridges are repaired, once the railroad tracks are repaired, people can go back to the countries they came from. So they're just in the wrong place. They didn't flee. Many people didn't agree, but they're sort of excluded from the Refugee Convention. Expellees are ethnic Germans, people who are labeled as German because they themselves, their parents, their grandparents, or great-great-great-grandparents at one point moved from Germany to one of the countries that had been occupied by the Nazis during the war. And after the war, these countries say, you have to leave because you're German, not by nationality, but by origin. The Netherlands did as well. It told all the people who were seen as German to leave after the Second World War, even if you didn't do anything during this war. So these expellees are excluded from the Refugee Convention. And the reason for that is not because they're not targeted because of their ethnicity, they are, but the reason is that people say, okay, we're not going to include in the Refugee Convention those who caused the Second World War. And so that's why expellees couldn't be included in the Refugee. So you have the Refugee Convention, and the Refugee Convention, this is this one, people who have been are persons who have a well-founded fear of persecution because of their political opinion, nationality, race, religion, or because they belong to a particular social group. And this is a very strange sentence within the Refugee Convention. The other ones are clear. You can say, okay, I'm persecuted because of my religion or because of my nationality. Help. Social group is completely vague. A social group was introduced into the Refugee Convention at a very late moment in time when it was nearly concluded already. And somebody said, social group, that's actually the Finns said social group. When it was introduced, nobody thought it would be applied as it is today. Because today, people who are persecuted because of sexuality, which means homosexual man, because that's what it has been applied as, can get refugee status because of homosexuality, because they're persecuted because of their sexuality. When it was introduced in 1951, the suspicion that somebody was a homosexual was reason to deny them the chance to naturalize in a country, to acquire citizenship. And so in the Netherlands, you have a few cases where people who came in the 1920s, 1930s, some of them escaping Nazism, after the Second World War, applied for Dutch citizenship, and authorities said, no, I don't think you qualify for citizenship because we think you're a homosexual man. I mean, it's never about women. So they were denied the right to acquire Dutch citizenship. Nobody thought that the Refugee Convention could be applied to this group. It only changed very late, in the 1980s, it started to change, and people started to say, social group, maybe that's people who are persecuted because of sexuality, or dress code. Currently, you can also have refugee status because of your dress code. Okay, and then labor migration. This is the one the one I mentioned second. Like I said, when it was introduced, it applied to these countries. Please note that Algeria was included at the point in time, and it currently applies to these countries. So the number of countries increased. The mobility between these countries increased. The ease with which you can move between these countries is it's very simple to move between these countries. Very often people also say these are not migrants, and you only talk about third country migrants, people who come from outside the EU, not from inside the EU. When the guest worker migration regime was in place, 1960s until 75, somewhat, also people came who could have applied for refugee status. People who were fleeing the regime of Salazar, that's the Portuguese fascist dictator, Franco in Spain, people who were fleeing the colonel's regime, very repressive colonel's regime in Greece, people who are fleeing the political coups and the persecution of, for instance, Kurds in Turkey, people who are fleeing the years of lead, that's the repression in Morocco under King Hassan, they could have applied for refugee status, but they didn't. And if they did, they were denied. And so during the guest worker migration regime, many people could have applied for refugee status, but the few who didn't get it because the authorities went like, yeah, you're coming from a country which is actually a guest worker sending country. So you get a guest worker status, not a refugee status. So some people from Portugal said, can I be a refugee? And the Dutch authorities just laughed at them and they said, you will stay as a guest worker. And when the labor migration or the guest worker migration regime ended in 1975, the very same people applied for refugee status. And the same people with the same motives, coming from the same regions, said, can we now be refugees? And this shows the fluidity of these categorizations. These categorizations, these four, which I said, which are very sort of, seem to be very static, very closed concepts, they are not. And you see very clearly, when you look at how it is used, these categorizations, that people can move in and out of these categories easily, depending on what the situation is. And with guest worker migration, more people apply for refugee status. If you think something is unclear, please say so. Eh? Okay, and then you have family migration, Article 8 of the Convention of Human Rights. It says, as a family, you have the right to bring your children up to the age of 18 to the Netherlands, which means that for some people, time is a problem. If your children are nearly 18 and the procedures take forever, then at one point in time, the oldest child will not be able to come. So there's a lot of pressure on migrants to make sure that they hurry through the process. What you see currently is two changes in this categorization. One is that the rules regarding adoption have changed so that, for instance, same-sex couples can adopt children very easily. They're recognized as the parents of the adoptee. This wasn't the case when this rule was introduced. But regarding Islamic countries, it has become much stricter. So in many Islamic countries, Turkey and Indonesia excluded, it's not possible to adopt children within the country. So for instance, if you're coming from Algeria and you have brought up the child of your deceased sister for, 5-6 years, and you come to the Netherlands, you may be the foster parent of the child, but you're not the adopter of the child. So you can't bring the child. So at that point in time, you have to leave the child of your sister, which has been part of your family, behind in the country of origin, because they don't have a law regarding adoption in the country of origin. So the Dutch authorities say, not formally adopted, sorry. You have to leave your child behind. And if you then pretend that it is your child, they will send it back. And the other thing that you will see currently is DNA testing. It becomes, I don't know how many of you do DNA testing. It's great because then you go to MyHeritage and find out you have 1,200 relatives throughout the world. Great fun. Should give it a try. So not the one that says that you're 99% Dutch or something like that. That's not the one. I meant the one which actually finds your relatives. But DNA testing has been introduced by authorities. It has been criticized greatly. But it's used sometimes to say, okay, here comes this woman with 4 children. They have to be DNA tested. And if one of them turns out not to be the child of the father, it's not about the child of the mother. It turns out to be not the child of the father. This one child has to stay in the country of origin, for instance, Eritrea. And so if you have been raped, for instance, and then one of the children is a result of that, or you had an affair, then this child is supposed to be left behind. So you see. You would think so, but authorities can make these claims. They can say, either we let you in and you prove this, or you don't prove it. It's your right not to do it. And it's your right to say, okay, but that's my privacy thing. But then you're not coming. And so, but in France, many people then said, look, you DNA test all the children of French fathers, and I'm sure you'll find out quite a few are not the children of the father that think he is the father. So there was it led to a lot of debate, and also The French stopped doing it, and now it's voluntary. In France, it's voluntary. If you don't do it, your procedures get delayed, and then you get to the 18 years limit. Do I manage to get the children in before they're 18? So, oh yeah, everywhere it's contested. And what they do is they make it semi-voluntary and say, we can push your family through within a few months, or we will start inquiring and it will take forever. Okay, and then you have this group, the returnees, and I said these are people coming from the former colonies, like the Dutch East Indies or Suriname, French Indochina, British India, people who say they are part Dutch, they say they're part French or part English, depending on what country they're coming from. But that migration is not as important as the other one, the countries who recognize people who come from countries where they have been deported from by the Soviet regime. So this is, for instance, Egon Finns, so people from Finland who moved just across the border into Russia. But when Russia became the Soviet Union, they were distrusted and moved away from the Finnish border into the interior. And now they say we're actually ethnic Finns, and they can get citizenship of Finland. And the same applies to Greece and Romania and Hungary and and so many of these Eastern European countries make it possible for people who say, okay, I'm actually ethnic Greek, ethnic Romanian, ethnic Hungarian, to get their citizenship, the original citizenship back, as do the Spanish. The Spanish say, okay, if you can prove that your family was driven out by the Spanish Inquisition, 1492, there you go, then you can reclaim Spanish or Portuguese citizenship. So people can currently come into the EU from Turkey or Latin American countries by proving that they are actually have been driven out by the Spanish Inquisition. And these migrations are currently much larger than migrations. Okay, what I do in my own research is looking at migrations from a governance perspective. And governance perspective simply means that I don't look at the national government only. Of course, I look at the national government, but not at the national government only, but also at local governments, so the municipal authorities, international bodies like the EU and the UN. And I don't, the state authority is not the only authority. NGOs, non-governmental organizations, also play an important role in influencing, shaping policies and how they are applied, how they are, for instance, supported or not supported. This is called the multiplier effect. If organizations work with authorities, policies work out different from when they work against these policies. So you have to look at NGOs and IGOs, intergovernmental organizations, and non-governmental organizations. You have to look at firms, shipping companies, but also multinationals who move people around very easily. You have to look at the role of the media. The media play an important role in how policies are seen. And why is it important to look at this governance perspective? Because currently, as you know, there is a lot of debate about the failure about policy failure. And the fact that policies, for instance, regarding integration or migration, are seen as failing undermines, to a very large extent, the trust in the working of democracy. And so there's a lot of debate about, look, if all these things don't work, why bother? And so it is important to look at all these actors, like I said, states, NGOs, IGOs, but also firms in the media, to explain what's happening, because otherwise, if you don't, you might say, oh, the government came with these policies, and then it didn't work out. Not working out of policies that don't work out as intended, is called the gap theory. The gap between policies on the one hand and practice on the other. And like I said, I do this in my research. We also have an interdisciplinary master that we run at Leiden, which I started 10 years ago by creating it. It runs now for 5 years. It's called Governance of Migration and Diversity. And in that master, that's the key element. And what we want students to learn is you have to look at all these actors. You have to look at also from many perspectives, but look at all these actors in order to understand the workings of policies. Now, like I said, you have a gap theory, a theory that explains the difference between policies on paper and policies in practice. That's what the gap theory says. As you may know, policies never work out as intended, never ever. And for us, what is for us to explain, for us as historians, for us as academics, but also if you go into policy at one point in time, is why. And why is there this difference between policies and practice? You can see it here. This is when the first alien law was introduced in the Netherlands in 1849. And this is registration from Amsterdam, which I made at one point in time. And you see very nicely here that when this law regarding the registration of aliens was first, aliens means foreigners, when this law was first introduced, all foreigners were registered. And then you would think, if you look at the graph, after that, it went down sharply and back up again somewhere around the First World War. That's, of course, not true. The numbers didn't fall. The numbers of people that registered were falling. The number of people who were dead shows this curve rather than that curve. And so authorities, when it was first introduced, went, oh, now we start registering all the foreigners that are in Amsterdam. And after a rather short period, as you can see, they gave up on the idea. And they produced these ledgers, but they said, let's just register the prostitutes and be done with it. And so not bother about everybody. Just, some of the people we worry about most. And only here, which of course can explain why the sun increased. Why the sun increased there? Just first World War. What? Yeah. Suddenly, you have a large number of refugees because of the First World War, but also a distrust regarding this idea of we don't even know who the people are. We haven't registered anybody. Are these people sort of undermining? Are they loyal to our regime in terms of loyalty? Are they? Mag nog eventjes doorgaan, hè? Ik mag nog eventjes doorgaan, toch? Ja, ik dacht dat wij toestemming hadden om nog een kwartiertje mijn verhaal af te maken. Helaas niet. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So these policies which are developed fall into disuse very soon. And this is not only in this case, but also in many other cases, you see the same development. If I talk about NGOs and IGOs, this is what I'm talking about. IGOs are organizations like the Red Cross and Caritas, but also Doctors Without Borders, the World Council of Churches. These are very large organizations with enormous turnovers, large numbers of people working for them. And IGOs are things like the IOM. NGOs are very often, and this comes from Tocqueville. Alex de Tocqueville says, okay, we have to have organizations. He doesn't talk about NGOs, the word doesn't exist. We have to have organizations to sort of bolster democracy. He wasn't very keen. He wasn't greatly enthusiastic about the idea of democracy. He was actually not such a fan from democracy. And he looked at the United States and said, all these organizations, let's not have that. Because then people start to think that they have an influence on policies. But later his idea, although it wasn't his key idea, was adopted by many people. And the idea is that, these NGOs will bolster participation within society, will increase the trust in organizations, the trust in authorities, the trust in lawmaking. And you see this idea reflected, for instance, in the EU, who sort of recognizes certain NGOs and works through them. So they want to have their policies implemented. They work through NGOs. They're also criticized a lot. NGOs are also criticized a lot and seen as failing. So they're seen as failing in certain points in time. For instance, during the Biafra civil war, the civil war in Nigeria, you see that people say, okay, the state is failing, but also traditional NGOs are failing and we need new organizations. Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, is set up during the Nigerian civil war out of criticism on the existing NGOs, saying, look, we don't want the type of old-style organizations who are much too much in bed with the state authorities. We need new organizations who distance themselves from these states and criticize these states. Because we have not as much time, yeah, I skip ahead. And what I want to address is that it's not only NGOs, but it's also the media. And the media that play a role. And you have this concept of mediatization. And the idea that there are large changes in media land. There are large changes in media land. The competition between media has increased greatly, very much so. And the element that's important is that everybody is a journalist now. So you see that if something is not covered by mainstream journalists, it's covered by so many other people that mainstream journalists can't deny that it's happening. So if something happens in the street, somebody gets kicked in the face, all the phones go up. There's a constant media coverage by the amateur journalists. The question that we have, of course, is does this influence policies? And there's a very large debate about does it or does it not? And I studied that. And the problem that you have here is causality. It does. Do the media indeed influence policies, change policies, or don't they? And what you can look at is chronology. Do the media at one point in time do something, say something, use a certain argument, which is then copied by policymakers, or do they follow policymakers? And we studied this for the issue of family reunification, for instance, and we see that actually the policies were changed before the media started to cover this. So the media started a big scene about let's change the rules regarding family reunification, but before that, the policies had already been changed. We also had other cases, and that's interesting, because in the case of Hungarian refugees in 1956, a large number of people, 235,000 people, fled from Hungary. In the Netherlands, there were large demonstrations saying we want more Hungarians, get more Hungarians into the country. They were seen as the good migrants, proving capitalism right and communism wrong. And so there were large campaigns, and the media were very supportive of Hungarian refugee migration, but the authorities were not. But one of the newspapers, the Waarheid, the party of the paper of the Communist Party, said we actually don't know who's coming. We see people there who are beatniks, that's people with man with hair that's too long. We see gypsies, which means Sinti and Roma. We see people who are too lazy to work. Maybe these are Nazi collaborators coming to us. And they use these arguments. So whereas the Catholic press, the neutral press, Telegraaf, etc., say they want more refugees, the Waarheid says beware. Don't take these people in. And the authorities go like, okay, we ignore all the others, but we use the argument of the communist press. Do you know who's coming? Do you know who's hiding amongst these refugees? So that's interesting. So they are influenced by the media, but they can't, it wouldn't be the ones that you expect. Okay, so the last one. Why migration history? First of all, and you said it nicely when you introduced me, you said very nicely, yeah, migration, that's been around forever. There's migration since there has been humanity. People, however, do want to stress that. So migration is of all time. Yeah, birth, marriage, and death is also of all time. So we still see it as something exceptional. So for us as historians, it's important to point out continuity. It's been there, it will be there. Okay. It shouldn't be presented, and we as historians have a role here, as a problem continuously. It's not a problem, there's no solution. It is important, history is important to understanding what's happening today. It is important to make policies for the future, although most of the predictions about future migrations are wrong. Historians have shown. And what is a key role that we have, and that's why I had to emphasize this governance perspective. What is important is to look at these multiple aspects, to look at local, national, international, at NGOs, at IGOs, at firms, at the media, all in one, to understand what is actually happening to a society, what's happening to policies, and why and when they don't work out as intended. And we as historians do have this liberty to look back in time. Policymakers are very often have a very short attention span. You want to win the next elections. You don't per se have the time to look back over a period of 70 years. The media, same thing. Very short attention span. They look at now and not so much at what happened in the past. Okay, with that I conclude.
Okay, thank you very much for that interesting and insightful presentation. I think it's a good way to start this research parade. Unfortunately, we have to leave now. So we'll take a break and we will start back at 1:30, but online. So that was it for now.